Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Dan Soddy, the Chief Scientist and co-founder of Decision Lens. Dan, good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
This process that we're going to be discussing, the Program Objective Memorandum, well known to people in DoD and the contractors too, for that matter, the POM process. But that's only a sub-process of a very long idea of getting things funded and paid for that the Defense Department wants to do. So give us just a general survey of the types of projects you work with.
Yes.
It's kind of surrounding that whole POM process.
Sure. So we work across the Department of Defense. They use our software to help with planning and resource allocation decisions in all phases of planning. We also work with the civilian government, with organizations like the FAA, where they're using our software to help with investment decisions and how they allocate resources. We also work with state and local governments in infrastructure planning and helping them automate how they allocate their limited budget to ensure that they're supporting critical infrastructure objectives. So across all different aspects of planning we work.
I guess the theme I'm hearing is complexity.
Yes.
Projects that have long life cycles, that have many players, that have many perhaps budget lines.
Yes.
And you quickly get into kind of quicksand, I guess, if you're not careful on this type of project.
Yes, and actually with the government, it's a huge challenge because when you look at most organizations, the planning process is broken up among different parts of the organization. So people who are looking at the long range often are slightly different than people who are looking at the mid-range. And those are different than the financial managers who are trying to figure out what to spend money on next month. And so there's a lot of challenges with how you organize these processes and manage data. My own experience comes out of having facilitated planning sessions. I actually work with the POM, you mentioned the POM, that's the 5-year DoD budget process, and supported Air Force Space Command in 1998 doing their POM process. So I've been at this for a while. What was interesting is at that time they were largely still using spreadsheets, manually collecting data, trying to merge it in an error-prone process, and then make decisions in a very fluid environment, and it was very challenging to do. Fast forward to today, and a lot of the organizations who we're not working with yet are still doing largely the same thing. They're trying to manage these complicated planning processes with spreadsheets and collecting data manually, merging it manually, and helping support decisions manually. But that creates breakage in planning and a misallocation of resources. And so what we are really focused on is how do we fix this problem? How do we get the government to become more effective at allocating resources? And oh, by the way, in a highly constrained environment where they only have so much flexibility in what choices they make.
And these spreadsheets, I mean, give us a sense of the type of data that's required. These spreadsheets are not like 3 columns by 5 rows. You're talking really big documents, correct?
Tom, that's absolutely right. For any of your audience who are planners, who are still using spreadsheets, I can feel for them because it's a very challenging thing to do. We work with an organization in the Army, the Training and Doctrine Command, and their people in the field need to go out and collect requirements to determine what they're going to fund for the next planning cycle. A lot of that process used to be done with spreadsheet calls where you're sending out 30 spreadsheets. Somebody's trying to bring those spreadsheets back together and build a plan with them, and then their changes are happening the whole time. They're making errors as they merge the sheets. Data's changed since they got the spreadsheet. They're briefing their bosses for a recommendation, and before the decision's even been made, the data's changed and they realize they got to come back. So it puts planners in a permanently reactive state to be using these antiquated processes for how they manage and make trade-offs using planning-related data. And I can describe what that is if that would be useful, what planning-related data is.
Yes, what is it? It's more than just money, but that's a part of it.
It's a set of needs or requirements that organizations have to fulfill their current and future missions, and those needs or requirements can be broken into needs to sustain what I'm doing today and also needs to help drive better transformation in the future. Rarely will you walk into a government agency where an executive comes in and says, I just want to keep doing what I've been doing for the last what we've been doing here for 25 years. I don't want to change anything. So as leaders come in, they're trying to prepare their organization for the future. And the way that they do that is by trying to drive transformation. They come up with new initiatives. But when they try and roll that out to the organization, the people who actually operate the day-to-day business are barely able to sustain what they do today. Now we've been in a continuing resolution, and that's really caused a lot of havoc in these organizations because it prevents them from doing any new starts in the continuing resolution process. And it makes even sustaining what they do today difficult. So those people are put under a lot of pressure because their leaders want to drive change. They can barely sustain what they're doing today in a chaotic government environment. And worst of all, they're trying to do this with spreadsheets manually. And it's time for a change. It's time to change that. We're now in the heading towards the first quarter of the 21st century, and we need to move beyond that.
And you mentioned the planning data takes place in a couple of different formats, but
Yes.
What is generating the planning data? There must be financial systems and...
So the planning data comes from multiple areas. It comes from people who identify new needs. It comes from existing financial systems. It comes from analytical groups who identify gaps in our future capabilities, and they're trying to make recommendations of how you drive change. It comes from people who are trying to sustain these ancient bases that we have across the United States. A lot of these bases were built, military bases were built 100 years ago, and they're not keeping up with the future. So I believe, honestly, the most important thing in DoD and across our government is how they allocate resources. That's going to define how they do in the future. No matter what weapon system you have today, your ultimate effectiveness depends on how you invest over the long range to be able to stay ahead of our adversaries or to help an organization meet its mission, whether it's a civilian organization or a government organization, and make all this work effectively. And so our belief is that this is best accomplished by automating these phases of the planning process.
I want to get to that, but I just want to ask first, before we get to that issue of how you get around this, how fine-grained does this get? Because if you look at the military, they have really big programs.
Yes.
A new submarine building program that takes as a 30-year effort. Or, in the case of the Army, say they need a new land mobile vehicle type of thing.
Yes.
Or maybe a new comprehensive network, JADC3.
Yep.
That affects all of the armed services and the Pentagon. But then you mentioned it gets down to, say, sustaining an ancient base,
yes,
which might be a new parking lot we need, and it's already crumbling or something from the last one. So it sounds like they have both tactical problems,
yes,
as well as strategic problems in making sure that the money is there when it's needed and that they can execute on that particular project.
That's absolutely true, and track the performance impact of it. We have this concept with our software of how do you move the needle, moving the needle analytics. Well, first of all, you need to figure out what is the needle for the type of investment that you're making. Is it improving the condition of our facilities? Is it modernizing our weapon systems so that we can deliver a lot of weapon systems 15 years from now? And so within each of these planning processes, as they define requirements, they need to define what their performance measures are. How am I going to drive effectiveness in the organization? And that's very hard to do, as I said, with spreadsheet-based processes. So the goal is pull those spreadsheets into a living planning framework and enable stakeholders now to operate in a living system where they're collecting requirements, prioritizing requirements collaboratively, running resource allocation scenarios to evaluate choices, and then systematically tracking and improving the way that they make decisions. And so that's what we're talking about, is a migration away from event-based, spreadsheet-based planning to a more integrated, continuous way of looking at the decisions you make at each phase of the planning process, futures to mid-range planning to short-range planning and spend planning and budgeting and execution, all of it.
And you mentioned pulling the spreadsheets into some kind of an analytical environment, but
Yes.
do you really need to pull in the spreadsheets, or is there a way to get rid of them altogether and
Yes.
put your data into some other type of field that is more useful and more dynamic, or maybe more agile might be the word?
Absolutely, but the reality is right now the data is managed in spreadsheets and you want to meet them where they're at. I don't want them to have to start something completely new. Give me what you got, let's put it into the software, And now you can engage your stakeholders collaboratively in the process of managing and updating that data from now on. And if they're able to do that, we can start to track the history of how assumptions are made, how resources are allocated, and use that information to drive better and better frameworks for how we allocate our budgets. Government effectiveness is ultimately defined by how resources are allocated.
Sure. And getting back to the spreadsheets for a moment, I guess maybe the virtue of them, if there is any, is that at least it's machine readable data to begin with.
Absolutely.
And just again, a process question. So if the spreadsheets are in an environment, say under the decision lens methodology,
yes,
can you also change things in the spreadsheet without going in, as you say, and if there's 30 spreadsheets and you have to change the same cell in all 30,
yes,
then you haven't gained much. So
Our goal is to have moved them off the spreadsheet. They're going to pull it into Decision Lens, and they're operating in Decision Lens and using it. However, you do have the data you need to connect to. You also need to connect to your systems of record. So the software has the ability to connect through an API to your existing systems and pull data in. But a lot of the pre-decisional data is not in the systems of record. It's in people's Word documents and spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides, and it's fragmented, and it makes planning break through every phase of the planning process if you can't better automate how that's done. And that's really our entire mission, is to help support that goal.
Yeah, so for that information, like the decisional documents, say, that could be a doctrine statement,
yes,
which exists as a, prettified, but it's basically a Word document, maybe made into a pretty PowerPoint.
Yes.
But it's not compatible exactly with data coming from systems of record or from the derivative spreadsheets.
Yes.
So that sounds like a pretty difficult integration problem.
It is.
Because those are the documents that are actually stating what it is leadership wants to do.
Well, and the interesting thing about those documents, Tom, is they're a list of aspirations where nothing's prioritized. Well, is everything equal? Do I focus my limited resources on everything equally? That's probably not the case. So in these analytic frameworks, you want to enable people to establish the relative importance of that guidance, those goals and objectives in the context of what they're trying to do. If it's a weapon system that we're trying to use to defend the United States, a future bomber, we want to be thinking about what is needed in terms of performance for that bomber to deliver its future mission. And how do we effectively allocate our limited dollars not only to prepare for that future mission, but also sustain the bombers that we have in the air today? And how to become more deliberate. It's got to get off of PowerPoints and snapshot briefings that are not well connected in a continuous planning process.
All right, you've laid out a pretty good problem. We're going to take a short break on that and come back and get into this a little bit deeper. My guest today is Dan Soddy, the Chief Scientist and co-founder of Decision Lens. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, on the special Bulletin Review, Modernizing Federal Government Planning, sponsored by Decision Lens here on Federal News Network.